While I was on a video call, something suddenly smacked into the back of my head. As I was startled and turned around, there stood my mother-in-law, Susan, with a nasty smirk on her face.
You seem to have a lot of free time, chatting on the computer. The maid should get to cleaning.
Apparently, Susan had thrown a dirty, wet rag at me. I was so shocked that I couldn't find the words. Ever since we started living together, I, working full-time, have been overwhelmed by Susan forcing all the household chores on me. It's hard enough being burdened with all the housework, but to be harassed like this is just too much. Tears of frustration and sadness were about to come, as Susan looked on, laughing gleefully at my misery. What turned the tables was a voice from the video call asking, "Do you have any last words?" The moment she heard that, Susan's face turned pale, and she started trembling. "My name is Claire. I'm a 27-year-old office worker, and I married my husband, Michael, who is 2 years older than me, 6 months ago. Since marrying, I've been living with my mother-in-law in her house. The reason I ended up living with my mother-in-law was because my father-in-law passed away. Just before we got married, my father-in-law died in an accident, leaving my mother-in-law living alone in a large house. Concerned that my aging mother-in-law would be living alone from now on, Michael, who was then my fiancé, suggested we live with her.
Mom's never lived alone before. It'd be tough on her to start now at her age, and I worry something might happen to her. So, I was thinking, would it be okay if we lived with her?
Michael is an only child, so maybe it's natural for him to worry about his parent. Thinking this, I agreed to live with my mother-in-law. However, my mother-in-law, in her mid-50s, turned out to be full of energy, to the point where I couldn't understand my husband's concerns. Since we started living together, she has been pushing all the household chores onto me and goes out almost every day to enjoy herself. Despite me working full-time.
Make sure you clean thoroughly today. And don't forget to mow the lawn. Have it finished by evening. Of course, that includes preparing dinner too. Okay, I'm off."
Wait, what? I have work and can't possibly do all that, Susan, and she's already gone. Naturally, with the limited time I had before going to work, it was impossible to finish both cleaning and mowing the lawn. I had no choice but to continue with the chores after returning home from work. That was my plan, but right after I returned from work, my mother-in-law came back too. She noticed that not all the chores were done and started to nag and sneer at me.
"You're still not done. Honestly, you're so inefficient. What have you been doing all day? Oh, and don't use work as an excuse, please."
Despite not doing any household chores herself, my mother-in-law, Susan, had the audacity to lecture me, which was honestly infuriating. But arguing back would only prolong the conversation, so I remained silent and downcast, listening to her smugly dish out one sarcastic comment after another.
"Whatever. Just get dinner ready quickly. Michael will be home soon. It's unthinkable to not have dinner ready when a tired husband comes home from work."
After her tirade, Susan seemed satisfied and left the area. The delay in preparing dinner was due to her long talk, a fact that left me feeling unjustified as I began cooking. Thus, after only a few months of living with her, I found myself regretting the decision to live with my mother-in-law, as she continued to boss me around and make snide remarks daily. My husband, oblivious to the strained relationship between Susan and me, was busy working at the company run by his grandmother. This company, originally established and expanded by his grandfather, was being managed by his grandmother after the grandfather's death. There had been plans to pass the leadership to my father-in-law as the grandmother aged, but he passed away before this could happen. Since my mother-in-law, who had never worked in the company, couldn't take over, my husband became the successor. Michael is busier than regular employees because he is also training to take over the company, in addition to his normal duties. Until he is fully capable of replacing the president, his grandmother continues to lead the company. Being the president for many years, the grandmother is very straightforward and dislikes dishonesty, often adopting a strict attitude towards herself and others. Susan, having been strictly disciplined by her own mother-in-law initially, seems to have a fear of her, showing discomfort at the mere mention of her name. On the other hand, I found that my preferences and thoughts were similar to the grandmother's, and we got along well from the start of my marriage. Fortunately, our relationship wasn't as close as a typical mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, which perhaps helped us to quickly warm up to each other. And before I knew it, I was visiting grandmother-in-law on my own during holidays. Susan, disliking the close relationship between her mother-in-law and me, started making snide remarks more frequently after realizing how well I got along with her.
Claire, I see you're close with your grandmother-in-law. She's making an effort to spend time with you despite her busy schedule. Don't you realize you're getting in her way? Maybe you should show some restraint.
And perhaps to keep me from visiting my grandmother-in-law, Susan started to exploit me even more than before.
I'm home. What? Dinner's not ready yet. Looks like the cleaning isn't done either. Isn't your efficiency lacking?
As soon as she returned home, Susan looked down at me with a scowl. I'm sorry, but I just got back from work myself, so.
I don't want to hear excuses. Just get it done quickly.
For me, working full-time and sometimes doing overtime, it's impossible to manage all the household chores perfectly. I wish I could at least buy some ready-made meals from the supermarket on the days I work late, but Susan insists. I don't want to eat something that looks unhealthy. All meals should be homemade. Exhausted by dealing with Susan's unreasonable demands, I took the opportunity when she was out to talk to my husband, Michael. Susan won't listen to me. Can you talk to her, Michael? It's impossible for me to manage all the household chores by myself when we both work. We need her help. However, even when I pleaded, my husband wouldn't listen.
Sorry, but I'm busy and tired from work. Can't you complain somewhere else?
I think he didn't want to hear me speak ill of Susan. My husband, training to be the successor at his grandmother's company, seems to be tasked with various jobs and literally works from morning till night, often even on weekends. Reluctant to burden my extremely busy husband, I couldn't bring myself to discuss Susan with him any further. In the midst of these uncomfortable days, I received a call from my grandmother-in-law on a day off.
There's something I can't figure out on my computer. Claire, I hate to bother you, but could you help me? Is now a good time?
I just finished my morning chores, so it's fine. I'll help if I can. Having just taken a break from my chores, I was happy to help my grandmother-in-law. I switched the call to a video chat and began remotely assisting her with her computer. Click this button and you'll get to this screen. Then, if you click OK here. As I was explaining and navigating the screen, suddenly, something cold smacked into the back of my head. What? Surprised by the suddenness, I quickly turned around. There stood Susan, smirking unpleasantly. Then, noticing a foul smell coming from below, I looked down to find a dirty, wet rat. Touching the back of my head where I felt wetness, my hand came away smelling foul, indicating Susan had thrown the dirty rag at me.
Chatting on the computer. You seem to have plenty of free time. The maid should get to cleaning right away.
I was profoundly shocked and speechless, both from being called a maid and having the dirty rag thrown at me. I couldn't understand any of it, including the usual harassment from Susan. Why should I be treated this way? What had I done? These thoughts swirled in my mind until I was momentarily dazed, with Susan looking down on me with a smug grin, saying nothing. An uncomfortable silence filled the house, broken only by my grandmother-in-law's voice.
Is there anything else you'd like to say before we finish?
Her voice came from the computer screen I was on a video call with. At that moment, Susan, realizing I was talking to her mother-in-law, went pale and began to tremble.
What, that voice? Could it be you, mother-in-law? You were talking to her.
It seemed Susan hadn't realized I was on a video call, as the screen showed remote control operations and not the grandmother-in-law's face. From the other side of the screen, her stern voice came through.
It's not just your voice I heard. I might not know how it looks from there, but I can see everything from here. I saw you throw the rag at Claire, clear as day.
Realizing her actions had been seen, Susan's face turned ashen, her mouth opening and closing in shock. Ignoring her, the grandmother-in-law might have ended the remote control session because her face then appeared on the computer screen, looking as stern as ever, glaring sharply at Susan.
Really, hurling insults and even doing something as dreadful as this in front of me. What were you thinking? I think you owe me an explanation.
It's not what it looks like. I was just trying to scold her for neglecting her chores.
Susan, sweating profusely and flustered, responded to the grandmother-in-law's questioning. The grandmother-in-law stared at her with an icy gaze.
What nonsense is this? When I called, Claire said she had finished her morning chores. Are you suggesting she lied? And even if so, what's with the rag you threw at her? Is that your idea of discipline? And how do you explain calling her a maid? Do you actually think of Claire as a maid? Enough with the jokes.
Well, it's just.
Susan was so intimidated by the relentless questioning that she couldn't provide a straight answer, her eyes darting around. Perhaps exasperated, the grandmother-in-law sighed heavily.
Enough. It seems I need to re-educate you. I'm coming over right now, so just wait there. You know what will happen if you try to run, right?
With that, the grandmother-in-law ended the video call. Susan stood frozen in front of the computer, her face a shade of desperate blue, speechless. Her demeanor was almost like how I had been earlier, stunned by the harassment I received. About 30 minutes later, both the grandmother-in-law and Michael arrived at our home. Having briefly heard from the grandmother-in-law during the drive, Michael had a stern look.
Well then, let's hear again. What exactly were you thinking with all this?
Though Susan had remained motionless since the call ended, she started trembling when confronted by the arriving grandmother-in-law.
It's really not what it seems. I wasn't bullying Claire. I just told her to take care of the housework instead of just playing around.
I ran out of my patience with my Mill, who kept making excuses even in this situation. And I burst out in frustration at Susan. Enough. You dump all the housework on me and go out to enjoy yourself. How is that fair? And for your information, I work full-time. I'm not out playing. There's no way I can meet your standards of housekeeping. Working 5 days a week from morning till night. How can one person be expected to clean every corner of the house every single day? It's unreasonable to expect me to cook a full-course meal for every meal, mow the lawn and water the plants daily, and never miss laundry and ironing. My frustration unleashed. I also laid bare to the grandmother-in-law and Michael how unreasonable Susan's demands and actions had been.
What the, Mom? You've been putting Claire through all this despite having all the time in the world because you're not working.
Michael, shocked by my words, began to confront Susan. With a stunned husband and a disapproving grandmother-in-law glaring at her, Susan shrank in size. Realizing Susan had nothing to say, Michael turned to me.
It seems I've made a terrible mistake. Claire, I'm truly sorry for not taking your words seriously. I had no idea you were suffering like this. I just assumed Mom was handling the chores. I should have realized sooner and addressed Mom's behavior. I'm so sorry.
Michael, looking pale, apologized.
You probably don't want anything to do with her anymore, right? Let's stop living with her and just be on our own.
Surprised by Michael's unexpected suggestion, my emotions shifted from joy to astonishment. Really? Are you sure? I hesitantly asked, wondering if I was just hearing things I wanted to hear. When I fearfully confirmed this thought, my husband nodded strongly and said, "Of course." My husband is serious, not lying, about trying to help me deal with my mother-in-law. Feeling supported and relieved, tears welled up in my eyes. However, Susan, witnessing our conversation, did not seem pleased with the development and suddenly became infuriated.
What's this, Michael and Claire? Both of you spouting such nonsense. Don't you know it's only natural for a daughter-in-law to perfect the housework? Serving the in-laws' home is a daughter-in-law's duty. Breaking up the cohabitation is out of the question.
Susan insisted she had done nothing wrong, and that the fault lay with the daughter-in-law who couldn't manage the house properly. Her self-righteous rant was incredibly selfish. I was about to retort to Susan's outrageous claims, but the grandmother-in-law cut in sharply before I could speak.
The only one talking nonsense here is you. If it's so natural for a daughter-in-law to serve her new family, then you should be the first to help out in our home.
Chastised by the grandmother-in-law, Susan's previous bravado disappeared, and she trembled with fear.
But, Michael, help me. I enjoy living with you, and your grandmother's house has maids, so there's nothing for me to do. Tell her I want to keep living with you guys.
Susan pleaded with Michael, crying, but he looked at her coldly.
Sure, having someone else do all the work while you play must be comfortable. But don't you see how hard Claire is struggling because of it? I don't care how important you think a mother-in-law is. Why can't you think of helping out?
Michael's logical rebuttal left Susan biting her lip in frustration. The grandmother-in-law, witnessing this, cut Susan down further.
Really? How shameful. clinging to your son like that. All right, if you're so keen on living together, then I'll live with you. Michael, arrange for the movers. Don't worry about the cost. Just make sure it can be done soon.
Commanding Michael efficiently, the grandmother-in-law caused Susan to panic.
Not that. Anything but that, please.
Despite Susan's desperate resistance, the grandmother-in-law's chauffeur dragged her to the car and transported her to the grandmother-in-law's house. As it was, my mother-in-law was forcibly taken to my grandmother-in-law's house with only her body. Susan's screams echoed like death throes. A few days later, the movers arranged by Michael transferred all of Susan's belongings to the grandmother-in-law's house, where Susan began her new cohabitation. Susan was being strictly trained in household and company chores by the grandmother-in-law.
Is that all you've done? You're too slow. At this rate, you'll never finish. Hurry up, then get home to start dinner.
I can't take it anymore.
Susan, overwhelmed by the variety of tasks, lived a miserable daily life. As an aside, Susan had a habit of overspending and had used up most of her husband's inheritance. Thus, no matter how much she disliked the grandmother-in-law's house, she couldn't afford to find a new place and move out. Once, Susan tried to flee and sneak into our home. However, Michael had changed the locks right after evicting her, so her key no longer worked. Realizing this, Susan banged on the door, shouting,
Michael, help me. Let me in. Please hide me.
Despite Susan's loud pleas, Michael and I ignored her until the grandmother-in-law arrived to take her back. Since then, we haven't seen Susan. Living alone in the spacious in-laws' home, Michael and I were relieved of stress and enjoyed our freedom. Perhaps the elimination of stress helped, and in time we were able to have a child. Awaiting the child's arrival, I now live a very peaceful life.